The first image is simple, almost still. A wide horizon, ash-gray and soft in the early light. The sun does not rise quickly here. It lifts itself slowly as though it too is tired from the long silence of the wasteland. Its glow is pale at first, filtered through drifting curtains of dust, and then it grows warmer, touching the flat ground with faint ribbons of gold. The dust plains stretch outward, unbroken except for the scattered silhouettes of old-world remains. Rusted silos stand like frozen sentinels. A broken railway track, half swallowed by sand and creeping weeds, leads nowhere now, but its lines still suggest direction, as though memory alone could guide someone west. The earth is not entirely barren. There are small clusters of stubborn sagebrush, pale leaves coated with powder. In the distance, the faint bleat of Brahmin carries through the thinning night air. It is here that the settlement wakes. Not in haste, not with alarm, but with the quiet deliberation that comes when survival has learned to make peace with repetition. The first settler to stir is Calarin, a figure neither young nor old, moving with the measured calm of one who has walked the same path many mornings before. His task is not grand, his purpose is not heroic. He tends to the weather vane. The vane is mounted on a tall pole just beyond the settlement's communal hall, fashioned from scavenged iron sheets cut and hammered into the crude outline of an arrow. It squeaks faintly as it shifts. Its job is simple. Tell the settlers where the wind leans, warn of dust storms, signal the drift of ash clouds. Calarin carries a small tin of oil in one hand and a cloth in the other. He places his tools down on a flat stone, then shades his eyes with his palm to study the vane's movement. For a moment, he simply watches. The vane turns, but the air is still. There is no wind brushing his cheek, no dust stirred at his boots, and yet the vane tilts, just slightly, as if acknowledging something unseen. He does not frown. He does not call alarm. Instead, he notes the detail in silence, then climbs the ladder propped against the pole. The rungs creak softly beneath his weight, wood long sun-bleached but still serviceable. At the top, he wipes the vane with slow strokes, removing the powder of yesterday's ashfall. He dips the cloth in oil and rubs it along the joint until the squeak eases into a smoother hum. The motion is practiced. It is competence itself, a small act of care that keeps the settlement steady. When he descends, the horizon has brightened. The world does not seem changed, and yet the faint strangeness remains, the vane moving as though stirred by memory rather than weather. Calarin makes no judgment. He simply observes and carries the thought with him. At the communal hall, a table waits. On it lies the ledger, a thick book bound with scavenged leather, its edges worn smooth from decades of handling. Every morning and every evening, the settlers record something within it. Not everything, not every detail, but enough to make memory survive. Calarin opens it to the page marked for the day. Yesterday's notes are brief. Ash light, 2 Brahmin calved. Dust storm held to the north ridge. He sharpens his pencil, a stub shortened by years of use, and writes, dawn clear. Ash light soft, vane moves without wind. The words sit quietly on the page, neither dramatic nor uncertain. They are record, not judgment. They will be read again, perhaps by others tomorrow, or perhaps by children years from now. Closing the book, Calarin rests his palm for a moment on its cover. The leather is warm from the rising sun. It feels steady, as if the act of writing itself gives shape to the day. Around him, the settlement begins to stir. Doors open with low wooden groans. Children step out carrying tin cups, rubbing their eyes. A woman stretches a line of cloth across 2 poles, shaking the dust from garments before pegging them with bent nails. Someone draws water from the well, the bucket rope creaking with its familiar rhythm. All of it blends into a hum, the soundscape of quiet survival. From beyond the fence, the Brahmins shuffle, their bells clinking gently. The animals are tethered but restless, snorting softly at the rising light. A boy walks toward them with a brush made from tied twigs, patting their flanks as he cleans the dust from their hides. He hums as he works, his voice carrying faint but clear, merging with the morning air. The settlement is not large. No more than 30 souls, perhaps. A handful of houses built from scavenged timber and scrap metal, roofs patched with tarps and sandbags. But it holds. It endures. That, in this world, is no small achievement. As the sun climbs higher, the quiet rhythms of work spread. Someone arranges clay pots along the southern wall to dry. Another kneels in the small patch of garden soil, checking the leaves of stubborn maize plants, brushing dust gently from them with his fingertips. A young girl pumps the well again, filling jars, her face calm, though the handle resists her weight. And yet, amid these routines, there is still that lingering thought, the veins' strange movement. It is not ignored. Caloran has already noted it, and later others will see it in the ledger. But for now, no one seeks to solve it. Not with alarm, not with fear. Because here, at the edge of the wasteland, life has taught them that not every anomaly requires explanation. Some things are to be observed. Some things are to be remembered. And sometimes, what seems unexplained today will reveal itself tomorrow, if only one waits with patience. As midday approaches, Caloran sits beneath the shadow of the communal hall, pencil in hand again. He sharpens it once more, even though it hardly needs it. The act is soothing. He flips through earlier pages of the ledger, letting the voices of past days guide him. Some notes are practical, fence mended. Others are observational, dust thick. Ash fell like snow, and some, unexpectedly, are almost poetic. Lantern burned, though no one lit it. He pauses on that line. The words are faint, written years ago by a different hand. He reads them twice. Lantern burned, though no one lit it. He does not dwell. He closes the book gently. Later, perhaps, he will write his own entry beside it. But for now, the vein remains the only anomaly of his day. And so he lets the thought drift like ash carried softly on still air. Evening will come, and the ledger will be opened once more. The light will fade, the dust will settle, and the settlement will gather. But for now, the day is only beginning, and the horizon still stretches wide and unwritten. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with an image. Caloran lifting his gaze once more to the horizon, where the ash plains meet the sky. The sun rests fully above now, warm but muted, and the faint outline of the vein still moves against the stillness of air. He does not seek to understand it today, he only carries the record forward, and that, here, is enough. The ledger waits, its pages ready, and tomorrow someone else may write. A hinge, soft and steady, carries us forward, toward the ledger itself and the voices it preserves. The book waits, where it always does, upon the table in the communal hall, not hidden, not locked, but resting openly, as though it belongs to everyone and no one at once. Its leather cover has darkened with time, worn smooth by countless hands. When the door opens in the morning, the first light of day always falls across it, giving the impression that the book itself is being welcomed into each new dawn. Those who live at the settlement know the ledger as something more than parchment and ink. It is a kind of hearth, a fire that does not burn, yet gathers them. It is the one possession that feels less like property and more like a companion. Caloran has already written his note for the morning, brief as always. The vein turns without wind. The graphite mark is steady, his letters plain, no attempt at flourish. He places the pencil aside, and as his hand rests on the book, others begin to arrive. Marla, who tends the Brahmin, enters with her palms still dusted from brushing hides. She does not sit immediately, but she glances at the book the way one might glance at a trusted elder, reassured simply by its presence. Later, when she has washed and eaten, she will make her own mark. The rhythm of these entries is never forced. There is no overseer demanding that each person record. Yet over years, nearly everyone has contributed. Even the children, once their hands are steady enough, are encouraged to write a word or trace a simple shape so that the ledger holds their voice. Opening its pages, one can trace a history that feels both vast and intimate. The early entries are faint, written in uneven hands, the ink faded by time. Sus, storm heavy. We stayed indoors, braided rope for well. Childborn. They are not grand chronicles. They are not declarations of conquest. They are the breath of life rendered in ink. Turn a few pages further, and patterns begin to emerge. One hand always wrote about weather, meticulous notations of cloud cover, temperature, the thickness of ash fall. Another hand, years later, preferred to list every trade, a jar of maize for a patch of cloth, 2 eggs for a tin of oil. Another voice simply noted names, who came, who left, who had walked the perimeter. Together, these fragments form a chorus. The ledger is not consistent in style, nor in tone, but that is its beauty. Like the settlement itself, it is shaped by many hands, none louder than the others. One entry from years past reads, "Lantern burned though no one lit it." The words are brief, the letters slanted as though written quickly, perhaps before sleep. Yet the phrase lingers. More than once, similar notes appear. Months apart, even years apart, but always the same. The lantern at the far watch point glowed when no one claimed responsibility. Some settlers smile when they read it, calling it imagination. Others simply nod, accepting it as one of many mysteries the land offers. Still, the phrase recurs often enough that it has become a quiet motif. Another pattern appears in the vein. Again and again, across seasons, different hands write. Vein turned though the air was still, always observed calmly, always logged without judgment. To leaf through these pages is to watch the repetition of anomalies across generations, never alarming, always folded gently into the rhythm of life. A child, no more than 8, enters the hall with dusty feet and curious eyes. She approaches the table shyly, holding a stub of pencil. She has only recently learned to write her name, but today she wants to try something new. Calorin smiles faintly, turns to a fresh page, and sets the ledger before her. She writes in wavering lines. Light soft. 2 words, crooked but clear. She sets down the pencil, pleased, and scampers off again. Calorin leaves the entry untouched, a reminder that the ledger is not only for recording the unusual, but also for naming what is plain, what is felt. In time, those 2 words may sit beside notes of storms, of trades, of anomalies, and together they will matter equally. At midday, the hall fills with a quiet gathering. The settlers share bread, boiled maize, and a pot of thin stew. Conversation drifts in low tones, punctuated by the occasional scrape of spoons. The ledger remains open at the center of the table, like a silent guest. Marla reaches forward, turning a few pages back. She reads an older entry aloud. Ash fell like snow, covered the garden, cleared it with care. Her voice is calm, almost reverent. She remembers that day. She remembers brushing leaves clean with her hands, children helping beside her. The act of recalling brings a hush to the table, not heavy, but soft. Another settler adds, I remember too. My hands ached from sweeping, but the maize lived. The conversation does not dwell. It moves gently onward, yet the act of remembering seems to settle the room, grounding them. Later in the afternoon, Calloran sharpens the pencil again. He copies a line from a page written many years ago, tracing over faded letters to keep them visible. The entry had read, "Lantern lit. No hand." His pencil follows the old graphite, steadying what time had begun to erase. In doing so, he preserves not only the words, but the voice of the one who wrote them. The act is not for him alone. It is for the children and for those yet to come, who will one day read these pages and know that others, long before us, saw the same things and cared enough to remember. By evening, the hall glows in lantern light. The ledger sits open again, awaiting the night's final notes. A few settlers lean over it, whispering softly about whether to record every detail, or only those worth remembering. The debate is not new. Some prefer brevity. Only storms, trades, repairs. Others like to include the subtle. A child's laughter, the way dust swirled in a spiral, the moment the wind stilled. Tonight, the decision is gentle compromise. Both kinds of entries remain. The ledger, like the settlement, holds space for all ways of seeing. One last note is added before the book is closed. Lantern seen. Watchpoint, faint glow. No one claims to have lit it. The entry is written with no alarm, only observation. The book is closed. The latch is tied with a strip of cloth. The hall grows quiet. Night falls on the dust plains. The stars are faint, blurred by drifting ash, yet they still shine. A slow wind passes, stirring the Brahmin, carrying the soft clink of their bells. In the distance, perhaps only imagination, a lantern glimmers faintly at the edge of the fence. The ledger will open again tomorrow. Its pages will continue to hold both the ordinary and the unexplained. And for now, the settlement rests in the knowledge that memory itself is a form of survival. The days following the first gathering of Vault 76's survivors were both fragile and formative. A settlement, even one no larger than a handful of scattered souls, needs more than walls to bind it together. It needs rituals, order, and a reason to hope. Yet in those early months, hope was an ember, dim, uncertain, and easily lost to the wind of despair. The land around the vault had never forgotten the firestorms of the Great War. Trees grew withered and crooked, their bark scorched to a permanent gray. Rivers carried ash down from the hills, leaving their banks coated in a fine, lifeless powder. When the rains came, they fell heavy and acidic, burning holes in old signage and rusting cars that had already been dead for 2 centuries. This was the soil in which the survivors were asked to plant the seeds of their new world, and so they began. At first, it was nothing more than a scattering of tents and makeshift lean-tos, stitched from salvaged cloth and the plastic tarps pulled from pre-war ruins. Each night, the survivors gathered close to the fire at the center of camp, the only light that could keep both darkness and despair at bay. Eliza Thornton, who had been among the most determined to find order, began drawing plans in the dirt with a stick. "We cannot live like wanderers forever," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "This camp is not a home. It is only a pause between suffering." Her words carried weight because she spoke them gently, as if to soothe children, and, in many ways, the survivors were children once more, adults stripped of certainty, relearning how to live. The first structure they raised was nothing more than a wooden hall, its walls uneven, its roof patched with rusted sheet metal. Yet within those fragile walls, they found something they had been missing: sanctuary. The hall was named Haven's Rest, a place where they could gather, share food, and sleep with at least a thin promise of safety. It was a simple hall, but it became their cathedral. If shelter was the first triumph, hunger was their first trial. The mountains offered little in the way of edible fruit, and the soil was poor, salted with the echoes of war. Hunting was dangerous, for the creatures that roamed the hills were not always the same as the deer and birds remembered in pre-war stories. One hunter, Elias Cross, was among the first to learn this. He returned to camp carrying the carcass of what looked, at first glance, like a stag. Yet its flesh glowed faintly in the dark, and its eyes still twitched long after it had been killed. When the meat was cooked, it released an acrid smoke that made the entire camp ill. "Not all things that appear familiar are safe," Elias warned. His voice was rough, and his hands shook as though the hunt had cost him something unseen. From that day onward, he became the keeper of their food supply, careful, cautious, willing to risk himself so others might not. In time, they learned to plant again. Mutated maize and hardy potatoes, their seeds scavenged from the ruins of old farmsteads, began to sprout in small, uneven rows. The harvests were meager, but they were harvests nonetheless, and in them lay a kind of quiet miracle, life growing in a land that seemed determined to remain barren. As days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, the survivors found themselves needing something more than survival. They needed meaning. They needed beauty. It was an old man named Jonah, a pre-war school teacher who brought music back into their nights. He had carried a battered guitar with him out of the vault, its strings rusted, its body scarred by time. Yet when his fingers touched it, the sound carried through the settlement like a memory from before the fire. The songs were not loud, nor were they joyous. They were gentle ballads, reminders of seasons once lost, autumn rains, summer winds, winter nights before hearths. They were lullabies for a generation that had no cradle, only the hard ground. Children who had never heard music before sat wide-eyed, swaying as if the notes themselves were magic. And perhaps they were. For in those quiet songs, despair seemed to soften, and the settlers remembered that they were not only survivors, they were inheritors of a broken but still living world. Yet not all shadows fall from nature alone. It was in the 3rd month that they first saw smoke on the horizon, columns rising not from forest fires, but from deliberate burning. Travelers began to whisper of others who roamed the wasteland, not seeking peace but domination. Raiders, they called them, bands of the desperate, the cruel, the lost. The settlement grew uneasy. They were not warriors. They were builders, dreamers, wanderers clinging to one another for survival. Eliza stood before them once more, inside the wooden hall of Haven's Rest. The firelight flickered across her face as she spoke. "We cannot control what storms approach, but we can choose how we stand before them. Fear will not save us. Unity will." And so they prepared, not with weapons alone, but with vigilance. They set watches at night, torches burning along the crude fence they had built of sharpened stakes. Children were taught to hide when the alarm sounded. Elders carried stones as if they were weapons of old. The raiders never came, not then. But the possibility hung over them like a shadow, shaping every decision, every whispered prayer. One night, as the cold wind swept down from the mountains, the settlers gathered around the largest fire they had yet built. It roared high into the dark, its sparks carried like stars into the wasteland sky. Jonah played his guitar. Elias spoke of his hunts, telling stories with careful humor. And Eliza, her voice soft, began to recite words not of command, but of remembrance. "We were not born to be wanderers," she said. "We were born to build, to belong. The old world is gone, but its fire has not died. It lives in us, so long as we remember to tend it." Those words settled into the hearts of the survivors, binding them more tightly than walls or weapons. They were no longer scattered souls from a vault. They were a community, fragile but real. And though the wasteland loomed wide and merciless around them, within the circle of firelight there was something greater, a sense of home. Thus the settlement took its first true breath, not yet a town, not yet a nation, but something more than a camp. Haven's Rest stood as proof that even in a world of ash, the will to live and to belong could carve sanctuaries out of ruin. But even sanctuaries are only pauses between. Storms on the horizon, other fires burned, and with them would come choices that would test not only their survival, but their very souls. For the wasteland is vast, and it remembers everything. The nights at the settlement had grown longer, not in hours, but in quiet expectation. The firelight of Haven's Rest cast gentle shadows on the walls, stretching like slow fingers across the wooden planks. From these shadows, the settlers learned patience, they learned observation, and they learned that sometimes anomalies were not dangers, but invitations to understanding. It was in one such night that the first lantern was seen beyond the fence. The glow was faint at first, a dim pinprick against the darkness of the ash plains. Those who saw it paused in their routines, holding their breaths as the small light wavered against the black. It was distant, just past the line of sharpened stakes that the settlers had set to mark their boundary. Eliza, standing at the fire with the others, studied the lantern with calm eyes. She did not reach for a weapon, nor did she call an alarm. Instead, she gestured for quiet, drawing attention to what was already there. The light. "Observe," she said softly. "Let us see what story it tells." The settlers, trained now in patience, did not argue. They watched. The lantern swayed gently, as if caught in a breeze too light to disturb even the ashes on the ground. No footsteps followed, no voices drifted through the cold air, and yet the presence of the lantern felt deliberate, intentional, an unknown hand marking a presence. Caloran was the first to approach the fence the following day. His steps were measured, careful, placing each foot with thought on the uneven, ash-coated soil. He paused at the edge of the clearing, where the ground dipped slightly and small tufts of hardy grass pushed through the dust. There, the lantern rested, unlit now, as though it had spent the night watching the settlement rather than moving toward it. Its glass panes were dulled by soot, and its handle was slightly bent, yet it bore the faint scent of oil and smoke, a quiet signature of someone else's care. Caloran traced the rim of the metal, noting scratches, small dents, and the patterns left by previous handling. His mind did not rush to fear. Instead, it catalogued the details. Height of the stake it had been hung on, angle of the handle, the faint residue of ash clinging to the glass. Every observation became a note in a silent ledger that he carried in his mind. The question of ownership, or purpose, remained unanswered. No one had approached from beyond the fence. No footprints led back to the lantern, and no sounds had been heard. Yet its presence was undeniable, and so the settlers began to consider the implications. Marla suggested leaving a note. She wrote on a scrap of paper, simple and clear. "We see your light. You are welcome." The note was attached to a nearby stake, fluttering softly in the breeze. It was a gesture not of provocation, but of invitation, a small olive branch offered without urgency. Over the next days, the lantern remained, sometimes lit, sometimes dark. Its movements were subtle. Occasionally it appeared slightly closer, as if testing the bounds of the fence. Sometimes it swung gently on its stake, responding to no wind. And each night, the settlers recorded its presence in the ledger alongside other anomalies like the vein and the previous unclaimed lantern. The children became fascinated. One evening, Jonah led them to the fence, encouraging quiet observation. "See how it glows," he whispered. "Notice how it moves without hands. Remember it, for it is teaching us patience. Watch, listen, and learn that not all mysteries demand immediate answers." The children nodded, their eyes wide, learning the lesson of the lantern not as fear, but as wonder. They traced patterns in the dust beneath it, arranging small stones and twigs into careful shapes. Though they did not know the source, they participated in the ritual of observation, adding meaning to the otherwise unexplained presence. As days turned into weeks, the settlers began to notice other subtleties. The lantern seemed to respond to movement within the settlement. When the fires burned bright, it dimmed slightly. When no one approached the fence, it glowed more steadily. These observations were catalogued not as threats, but as data, patterns that could be understood through patience and care. Caloran suggested experimenting with small gestures. A jar of water left by the stake, a small pile of ash arranged in a spiral. Over time, they discovered that certain configurations elicited changes. The lantern swayed more, its glow brightened or dimmed. No sound accompanied it, no figure appeared, yet the pattern of interaction suggested that someone or something was attentive, watching from beyond the boundary. Evening after evening, the settlers would gather at Haven's Rest and discuss what the lantern's behavior might mean. Speculation was careful, never panicked. "Perhaps it is a traveler," someone suggested. "Perhaps a signal," said another. Eliza, as always, encouraged observation without immediate judgment. "We do not need answers tonight," she reminded them. "We only need to watch, and to learn how to watch." It was this attitude, calm and deliberate, that shaped the settlement's response. The lantern was neither threat nor enemy, and so it became a teacher. The settlers learned patience, observation, and the subtle art of engaging with the unknown without panic. The nights continued. The lantern's presence grew as much a part of the landscape as the fence, the ash, or the distant mountains. Settlers began to plan around it, leaving paths clear and small lights of their own near the stake. Children laid pebbles. In careful arcs, adults arranged oil lamps to echo its glow. It became a quiet ritual, a bridge between what was known and what was not. Even Jonah played soft music near the fence at times, a lullaby-like strumming meant to harmonize with the lantern's glow. No one knew if it could perceive sound, yet the ritual brought calm, reassurance, and the deepening sense of community that arose from shared observation. And then, one morning, the lantern was gone. There had been no warning, no footprints remained, only a faint imprint of disturbed ash where it had rested. The settlers gathered, quietly noting the absence. The ledger received the entry, "Lantern no longer present." Empty stake. No one panicked. Instead, they recorded, observed, and continued their routines. The fire burned, the garden was tended, the children played. The absence of the lantern, like its presence, became a rhythm in itself, a lesson in impermanence. Caloran lingered at the fence for a while, scanning the horizon. Beyond the mountains, ash drifted faintly in the wind. The world remained vast, unknowable, and yet within the circle of the settlement, calm persisted. That night, as they gathered around the central fire, Jonas strummed his guitar. The notes were low, reflective, carrying across the ash plains. The settlers listened, letting the sound settle into the quiet spaces left by absence. Eliza spoke softly. "Some things appear, some things leave. Our task is to observe, to record, and to remember. That is enough. That is what gives meaning to each day and shape to our home." The words were gentle, but they carried weight. The settlement was learning that life in the wasteland was not about controlling every outcome. It was about care, patience, and attention, about noticing, recording, and understanding patterns, and above all, about the quiet resilience to carry forward when answers do not come. The night deepened. Stars were faint behind drifting ash clouds, but still present. The fire crackled, carrying its warmth across the wooden planks of Haven's Rest. Children slept in their makeshift beds, and elders leaned against the walls, hands folded, eyes reflecting the glow of the hearth. The stake where the lantern had rested remained empty, a small monument to observation, a reminder that mysteries were to be honored, not feared. And though its absence was noted, it left behind a sense of trust, a lesson that the settlement could survive uncertainty without panic, and that the world beyond the fence need not always be threatening. In the quiet of the night, as the wind stirred the ash and the fire crackled low, the settlers understood something subtle. They were not alone. There were presences in the wasteland, watching, moving, glowing in ways that did not harm. And the act of observing without fear, of recording without judgment, was their first bridge to a larger understanding of life in this fragile, ash-coated world. The ledger remained open, ready for tomorrow. And tomorrow, as always, they would watch. The wind moved quietly across the ash plains that morning, carrying with it the soft aroma of scorched earth and distant pine. The settlement had become accustomed to the rhythm of their days, tending the garden, noting the vein, watching for anomalies like the lantern beyond the fence. And yet, today, the air felt unusually expectant, as if the wasteland itself had paused to witness their routines. Caloran walked the perimeter early, boots tracing shallow tracks in the grey dust. He paused at the edge where the lantern had once rested. Its absence was still noted, yet it had left an imprint, subtle and instructive. The soft indentations in the ash suggested careful handling, as though someone had taken care to leave the stake undisturbed. He crouched to examine the ground more closely. Small footprints, unlike any he had catalogued before, traced a path around the fence. They were light, precise, almost deliberate, and they led toward a nearby ridge that overlooked the settlement. Caloran did not call for others immediately. Observation, he had learned, required patience, and so he followed the trail quietly, noting its contours, depth, and direction. The print spoke more of intent than haste, a rhythm of someone moving with purpose, but not urgency. Meanwhile, the settlement began its morning rituals. Marla tended to the Brahmin, brushing dust from their hides with careful, circular motions. Children helped, their small hands learning the cadence of repetitive, necessary work. Each sweep of the brush, each careful pat, reinforced a sense of order, grounding the settlement in quiet competence. Eliza moved among them, checking the garden soil, noting moisture and the faint traces of ash that had settled overnight. The settlers were skilled in the rhythms of survival, watering, weeding, repairing, recording. Every motion was deliberate, every observation stored not in panic but in careful memory. And yet, beyond the fence, the footprints lingered in memory. Caloran reached the ridge by midday. From there, he could see the settlement in its entirety, the small patch of garden, the wooden walls of Haven's Rest, the faint smoke of the fire still curling upward. And beyond it, the ash plain stretched in endless grey waves, occasionally broken by the remnants of old-world ruins, skeletal reminders of a world that had burned. The footprints ended at the top of the ridge. Someone had paused here, surveying the settlement with an attention that mirrored Caloran's own. He noted the patterns in the dust, circles, gentle indentations, subtle swirls that might have been made deliberately. Every mark suggested care, observation, and an understanding of the settlement's rhythms. Returning along the ridge, he marked his observations in the ledger, recording each nuance without judgment. The entries were precise: footprint depth, spacing, direction, and signs of lingering pause. These were not threats. They were presences, curious and cautious, yet entirely unknown. That evening, the settlers gathered around the fire. Jonah's guitar filled the air with low, contemplative notes, harmonizing with the crackle of the flames. Calorin described the footprints to the group, emphasizing the patterns and their subtle, deliberate nature. "Not a threat," he said calmly. "Someone has watched. Someone has moved carefully, and that is all we know." The settlers listened, absorbing his words without alarm. Observation and documentation, they had learned, were the tools of understanding. They did not need to act hastily. They did not need to assume danger where none had yet manifested. In the days that followed, more signs appeared along the ridge. Bits of cloth, carefully placed rocks, and small arrangements of ash hinted at a presence that moved with respect for the settlement's space. The lantern beyond the fence returned one night, faintly glowing, as if acknowledging the settlers' patience and care. The children, under Jonah's gentle guidance, began creating their own patterns in the ash. Small spirals and circles mirrored those left by the unseen visitor. In doing so, they engaged in a quiet dialogue, bridging the unknown with their curiosity and imagination. Eliza suggested a new ritual, a shared observation hour. Each evening, settlers would gather, noting subtle changes in the ash, the wind, the horizon. The practice became meditative, almost ceremonial, cultivating attentiveness and reflection rather than fear. Calorin recorded each detail in the ledger. His entries, precise and deliberate, captured both presence and absence. He noted the return of the lantern, the careful placement of stones, and the subtle gestures in ash patterns. Each observation reinforced the understanding that the wasteland, while unpredictable, could also be a teacher of patience, attention, and care. Even the smallest detail mattered. A faint scratch on a stake, the alignment of a pebble, the precise sway of the lantern, they all spoke of awareness, intention, and perhaps communication. One evening, as the sky darkened to a soft ash gray, the settlers noticed a figure standing atop the ridge, silhouetted against the faint glow of the horizon, not moving toward them, but observing. The posture was calm, unhurried, and deliberate. The settlers did not rush. Children were brought back to the fire. Adults continued their work with gentle caution, and Calorin took note of the figure's stance. The ledger received the entry. Figure on ridge. Observing. No approach. The figure lingered for a time and then disappeared with the dusk, leaving only footprints and subtle shifts in ash. The act was quiet, deliberate, and non-threatening, a lesson in the measured pace of the wasteland's interaction. In the days that followed, the settlers continued their routines with a renewed sense of rhythm. The garden thrived, the Brahmin were brushed, and the ledger continued to grow, chronicling not just survival, but the subtle stories of connection and observation. The lantern became a symbol of the unknown presence, returning and departing in quiet intervals. The ridge, once merely a vantage point, became a space of silent dialogue. And the settlement, grounded in patience and attentiveness, learned that even without full understanding, they could live in harmony with the unknown. That night, as Jonah played a soft melody and the fire crackled low, Eliza spoke softly. "We are not alone. We are being watched, and yet the watch is gentle. It reminds us that there is attention, awareness, and perhaps care beyond our walls. Let us not fear it, but learn from it." The words settled into the minds of the settlers, wrapping them in calm awareness. Beyond the fence, across the ash plains, presence met presence quietly, without alarm, without urgency, and the ledger remained open, ready to receive tomorrow's observations. In the quiet of the settlement, beneath the slow sweep of the stars and drifting ash, the people of Haven's Rest learned a lesson that would carry them far into the wasteland. That patience, observation, and gentle care were as vital as any wall, any fire, or any weapon. And as the night deepened, They slept with the soft reassurance that their world, vast and mysterious, could be understood one careful step at a time. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of ash and distant pine, tempered by the warmth of the rising sun. The settlement stirred slowly. Children stretched, adults moved with deliberate care, and the firelight lingered in the hallways of Haven's Rest until it was chased away by daylight. For weeks, the ridge had been a quiet companion. The footprints, the lantern, the figure that came and went, it had all been observed without alarm. Yet curiosity had grown quietly among the settlers. Questions remained unanswered, and as often happens in the Wasteland, curiosity and caution walk side by side. Eliza gathered the adults in the hall, not with urgency, but with measured thought. "We will move beyond the fence," she said softly. "Not to confront, not to chase, only to observe, only to understand." There was a pause. No one spoke, no one questioned. This was not an order. It was an invitation to slow exploration, a methodical extension of the rhythms already established in the settlement. By midday, a small group had formed. Calorin, Marla, Jonah, and a few others whose hands were steady and whose eyes were patient. They carried essentials, water, food, and a notebook for observations. Tools for repair and navigation were packed in leather satchels, each item accounted for. The path beyond the fence was, familiar only by sight. Ash crunched softly beneath their boots as they moved forward. Every step was careful, every motion was deliberate. The ridge came into view, and with it, the subtle marks that had been observed from a distance, arrangements of stones, spirals of ash, and faint scratches on stakes that once held the lantern. Calorin led, documenting each detail. Marla followed, her hands brushing against tufts of hardy grass and remnants of old-world signage. Jonah's guitar hung at his back, strings silent for now, a companion ready to translate observation into melody if needed. The group paused at the top of the ridge. From here, the settlement looked small, nestled in a circle of soft shadows and flickering fires. Beyond it, the wasteland stretched endlessly, gray and silver beneath drifting ash. It was in this quiet, elevated space that the settlers first noticed movement in the distance, a subtle shimmer like heat wavering over metal or light dancing across distant hills, not threatening, not fast, not insistent, but deliberate, precise, a presence observing the observers as the settlers had observed before. Calorin bent to trace the footprints, noting their spacing and depth. Each print spoke of attention and care. Someone or something had been there before them and perhaps still lingered, watching the ridge from a distance. Marla suggested leaving a marker, as they had done with the lantern at the fence. Carefully, they arranged small piles of ash and stone, spirals that mirrored the subtle marks they had catalogued for weeks. It was not a claim, nor a challenge. It was an invitation. Jonah strummed a few soft notes on the guitar, low and humming. The music was deliberate, measured as if it could reach across the expanse and communicate intent without words. The settlers waited. Minutes passed, unhurried. The wind moved in faint waves, rustling the ash, brushing against their clothes, whispering through the remnants of the wasteland. No figure appeared. No footprints returned. And yet, in the quiet, they felt acknowledgement, a subtle harmony between the world beyond the fence and the community within it. The group began a slow descent, following a natural curve of the ridge toward a small grove of skeletal trees. Here, the ash had thinned, revealing patches of soil that had begun to reclaim themselves. Hardy grasses pushed upward, and small wildflowers, pale and muted, grew in clusters. Calorin knelt to observe a single flower, its petals grayish lavender, dusted with ash. He traced the line of its stem, noting the resilience required to thrive here. Each small life, he recorded, mirrored the settler's own perseverance. Marla gathered samples of soil and small plant fragments, placing them carefully into pouches. Nothing was taken to impress or consume. These were records, observations, reminders that life persisted even in the greyest expanses. Jonah paused at the edge of the grove, strumming the guitar softly. The notes carried in waves, touching the ash, the ridge, and the horizon. There was no expectation of response. The music was its own dialogue, a gentle offering to the wasteland itself. As afternoon deepened, the group followed a narrow path toward an abandoned structure, a remnant of the old world. Its walls were cracked, windows missing, roof partially caved. Yet even in ruin, there was rhythm, order, and detail. They moved carefully through the doorway, noting splintered beams, rusted tools, and patterns left by previous occupants. The structure had been a home long ago. Its furniture was scattered, a testament to absence rather than destruction. Calorin traced handprints on a faded table, smudged by ash and time. Marla lifted fragments of old paper, brittle and unreadable. Jonah's guitar hummed softly against his chest as he moved. Every observation was catalogued in silence, an unfolding story without urgency, without fear. The structure, though empty, was not lifeless. It held echoes. A chair tilted at a precise angle, a bowl left near a window, shadows that shifted with the afternoon light. Each detail told the settlers something about attention, care, and human presence. Lessons they carried back to Haven's Rest. By evening, the group returned to the ridge, retracing their steps carefully. The sun dipped low, casting long, soft shadows across the ash plains. The settlement came into view, its fires flickering like distant stars. The ledger, open and waiting, received their notes, observed beyond the fence. Patterns of presence noted. No threat perceived, Calorin paused as he wrote. The simplicity of the words did not diminish their significance. Observation, documentation, and reflection were the community's tools. They had ventured beyond the familiar and returned with understanding rather than alarm. That night, the fire burned low, Jonah's guitar playing a gentle melody. Children slept in calm, deep patterns. Adults tended to tasks quietly, brushing ash from floors and checking supplies. The wind stirred faintly across the plains, moving dust and light in subtle waves. Eliza spoke softly, her words carrying more reassurance than instruction. The world beyond our walls can be strange, quiet, and patient. So too can we. Observe, record, and return. That is the rhythm that keeps us safe and that keeps us connected. The settlers listened, breathing with the rhythm of the wasteland. Beyond the fence, across ridges and ruins, presence and observation existed side by side, and within the circle of firelight at Haven's Rest, understanding was slowly building. The wasteland could be studied, respected, and gently known. The night deepened, and the ridge was empty once more. Footprints in ash, markers of observation, and the soft glow of lanterns marked a day of careful exploration. The settlers returned to their routines, strengthened by the knowledge that curiosity need not carry fear, and that the unknown could be met with patience and care. Tomorrow, the ledger would record new observations, and tomorrow, the ash plains would await, calm and persistent, ready to teach lessons to those willing to move slowly and watch attentively. The ash plains shifted in the morning light, subtle currents moving through the gray dust as if whispering across the wasteland. Haven's Rest awoke slowly, the fires of the central hall glowing weakly against the faint glow of dawn. Children stirred under blankets dusted lightly with ash. Adults began their quiet routines, and the world outside the settlement remained both vast and patient. Caloran walked along the outer fence, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the soft ash. He traced the edge carefully, noting a new anomaly. A set of footprints, smaller than the previous ones, leading not from the ridge but from a farther distance across an old, uneven road partially buried by time and debris. The settlers had learned the rhythm of observation. No alarm was raised. Instead, the footprints were noted, sketched in the ledger, and their patterns examined with deliberate calm. They led toward the settlement, curving gently as if to approach but never intrude. Eliza convened a small council in Haven's Rest. "These tracks are not the same as before," she said softly. "They are lighter, careful, and intentional. Someone or something is moving toward us." Her voice was calm, measured. There was no panic, only attentive curiosity. The settlers had learned that careful observation was a shield as strong as any wall. Marla and Jonah volunteered to follow the tracks at a measured pace, taking only essentials, water, notes, and a small lantern for light. The children remained in the hall, engaged in quiet crafts, while the adults maintained routines, watering the garden, tending Brahmin, repairing minor damage to the fences. The path led slowly through a shallow hollow, flanked by sparse clusters of skeletal trees. Every movement was deliberate, each step calculated to avoid disturbing the ash more than necessary. The footprints were intermittent, appearing, disappearing, and then reappearing again, patterns of patience and attention, not haste or fear. Jonah hummed softly as he walked, not as a call, but as a gentle rhythm to pace their steps. Marla observed each indentation, noting weight, spacing, and probable age. Calarin catalogued everything in the small leather-bound notebook, careful to record light pressure marks that suggested a cautious observer, one aware of the settlement's vigilance. As they moved, faint sounds reached them, the soft rustle of distant ash, a low hum of wind across metal remnants, and occasionally a subtle scrape or tap, too faint to identify but distinct enough to notice. They paused, observing without action. The world had taught them that attention, not reaction, was the measure of understanding. The footprints led toward a low ridge, where a small outcropping of rock formed a natural overlook. There, the settlers saw something unexpected. Another camp. Not large, but organized, with a few small fires burning in a careful circle. Smoke rose thinly, drifting across the ash like gentle gray ribbons. They watched without approaching. From this distance, the other settlement seemed both familiar and foreign. Fires, simple tents patched with cloth and metal, small stacks of salvaged materials, it mirrored Haven's Rest in careful order. And yet, no figures were visible. Calarin noted the positioning of the fires, the alignment of makeshift benches, and subtle signs of daily routines. Footprints in ash, displaced twigs, and slight smudges of soot along edges of tents. Everything suggested deliberate care and a rhythm of life, much like their own. Jonah strummed a few soft chords on his guitar. The music was low, deliberate, a hum that seemed to acknowledge the other camp without demanding attention. The fires flickered faintly in response to the wind, and the world held a quiet balance. Marla suggested leaving a token, a small, neat pile of stones arranged in a spiral near the ridge, visible but unobtrusive. It was an invitation rather than a challenge. The gesture, delicate and slow, was placed with careful hands, each stone aligned with attention. Eliza observed from a distance, noting not only the gesture, but the reaction of her own community. Patience and care were reinforced, cultivated through quiet observation and deliberate action. The unknown, while intriguing, was not to be feared. As dusk approached, the settlers retreated slowly back toward Haven's Rest. The new camp remained across the ash plains, its fires glowing faintly against the dimming sky. Footprints along the ridge were catalogued in the ledger, noting patterns, spacing, and subtle signs of movement. Everything was preserved as data, observation, and gentle memory. The fire at the center of Haven's Rest burned low that night. Jonah's guitar played soft notes, echoing the rhythm of the ash plains and the distant fires. Children slept under blankets dusted with ash. Adults performed quiet evening rituals, and the settlement exhaled into calm awareness. Eliza spoke softly, her words carrying through the warmth of the hall. "We are not alone, but that is not reason for fear. Presence exists beyond our walls, moving carefully, watching as we do. Let us continue to observe, to learn, and to record. That is the rhythm that guides us safely." In the quiet night, the wind stirred faintly across the plains. The other camp remained visible only as glimmers of firelight and faint smoke trails. The settlers of Haven's Rest understood that the wasteland, vast and patient, allowed for connection, without confrontation, observation without fear. The ledger received its final entry for the day. Observed distant settlement, fires and routines noted, no approach, patterns of care and attention recognized as the embers of the fire glowed softly and the stars emerged behind drifting ash clouds. The community rested in the understanding that curiosity, patience, and deliberate observation could bridge worlds without haste. And beyond the ridge, across the gray expanse, presence met presence, quietly, attentively, and without alarm. The morning air held a fragile quiet, soft as ash, settling over the remnants of the old world. Haven's Rest awoke slowly, the firelight of the central hearth fading with the dawn. Children stretched under blankets, adults moved through their routines, and the world outside, gray and patient, waited for them to act with care. Eliza gathered the council at the fire. "We observed another settlement yesterday," she said softly. "Fires, patterns, movement. They follow rhythms not unlike ours. Today we will leave a gentle message. Nothing more. There was no rush, no urgency. The decision was careful, deliberate, designed to preserve calm and maintain trust." The community understood. Communication was measured, not demanded. By late morning, Caloran, Marla, and Jonah prepared a small delegation. They carried essentials, a few tokens of goodwill, and the ledger for recording observations. No weapons were taken. Every movement was intentional and mindful, emphasizing calm rather than confrontation. The ash plains stretched ahead, soft and gray beneath boots. Footprints from previous reconnaissance were faint but present, guiding their path. The ridge loomed ahead, marking the boundary between their settlement and the distant camp. They paused at the top, observing the fires below. The other settlement was active yet peaceful, smoke rising in thin ribbons. Small figures moved deliberately, tending fire, arranging supplies, and performing subtle routines. Every action mirrored care, patience, and quiet organization. Marla suggested leaving a token on a small rock outcropping near the ridge, a simple spiral of stones aligned carefully, topped with a folded cloth. The gesture was visible yet unobtrusive, meant to convey acknowledgement and goodwill. Jonah played low, gentle notes on his guitar, a hum that mingled with the soft wind and the faint stirrings of ash. The music was deliberate, steady, meant to communicate attention and presence without demanding a response. Caloran catalogued every detail in the ledger: wind direction, visibility of the spiral, patterns of movement in the other camp. Each observation reinforced the settlement's understanding that contact need not be hurried or forceful. The day progressed slowly. Settlers in both communities moved in quiet routines. Fire was tended, meals prepared, tools repaired, and notes recorded. There was no rush to meet face to face. Observation, patience, and subtle gestures became the bridge between them. Eliza emphasized calm reflection. "Let us notice their rhythms," she said. "Their presence is deliberate. Ours is deliberate. That alignment is enough for now." Children watched the ridge from a distance, learning that patience could be active, that observation itself was a form of engagement. Their small hands traced patterns in ash, practicing the gentle gestures that had become familiar in Haven's Rest. As dusk approached, a subtle movement was observed in the distant camp. A figure, small and deliberate, approached the top of the ridge, not hurried, not threatening, merely moving with care toward the token placed by Haven's Rest. The settlers held their ground, watching quietly. The figure knelt, rearranged the spiral slightly, and left a small feather atop the stones. The gesture was simple, deliberate, and considered a response to the communication left earlier, a sign of acknowledgement and reciprocity. Jonah played a few more notes on his guitar, low and steady. The sound was mirrored faintly in the distant camp, a subtle, shared rhythm connecting presence to presence. Night fell gently across the ash plains. Fires burned in both settlements, casting warm glows through thin veils of drifting ash. Children slept under blankets dusted with gray. Adults tended fires and supplies, and the wind carried faint scents of soot, soil, and soft herbs across the plains. Caloran recorded in the ledger. Observed response to token. Spiral adjusted. Feather added. No intrusion. Patterns of care, noted Eliza, spoke softly to the group. Presence has acknowledged ours. That is enough. Observation, patience, and deliberate gestures can build understanding without haste. That is the rhythm we practice. The night deepened. The fires of Haven's Rest flickered low. The distant settlement glowed faintly, and the ash plains held their quiet expanse between them. The settlers exhaled into calm awareness, learning that connection could be made without force, that attention and careful gestures could communicate across space and time. Jonah's soft chords lingered, harmonizing with the subtle wind and drifting ash. Every note was deliberate, each movement measured. Children slept peacefully. Adults recorded observations, and the world outside remained vast, patient, and quietly attentive. The ledger remained open for tomorrow's observations, the ash plains awaiting new patterns, new gestures, and gentle understanding. And as the night stretched on, the settlers of Haven's Rest rested in the quiet lesson that connection could exist without alarm, that presence could be acknowledged with calm, and that the wasteland itself could teach the art of patience. Morning arrived slowly, brushing the ash plains with soft gray light. Fires in Haven's Rest glowed faintly before the dawn fully claimed the sky, and the settlement stirred into quiet routine. Children stretched and yawned under blankets dusted with ash. Adults moved deliberately through the tasks that formed the rhythm of the day, and the wind carried distant, whispered scents of pine and scorched earth across the plains. Caloran walked along the outer fence, observing faint traces left overnight. Small piles of ash, subtle shifts in stone arrangements, and soft indentations in the soil that suggested deliberate footsteps beyond the ridge. The distant settlement had responded again, quietly and thoughtfully, without intrusion. Eliza gathered the council near the hearth. "The presence beyond the ridge continues to engage," she said softly. "It is not random. Patterns are emerging. Today we will practice deliberate exchange." There was no urgency in her words, only calm observation and quiet encouragement. The settlers understood that this was not a rush to confrontation, but a careful extension of connection, a rhythm of patience and attention. A small group departed under mid-morning light: Calorin, Marla, Jonah, and a few others chosen for steady hands and attentive eyes. They carried essentials, including small markers and soft tokens, simple objects arranged to communicate acknowledgement and shared presence. No weapons were taken. Their steps left gentle impressions in the ash, a subtle trace of intention. The ridge approached slowly, every movement measured, every breath observed. Below, the distant settlement's fires flickered, smoke drifting in thin, deliberate ribbons. Shadows suggested activity: a figure arranging stones, another tending a fire, each action deliberate and patient. Marla suggested placing a new arrangement of stones and ash, slightly closer to the distant settlement than before. The pattern mirrored the previous spiral but incorporated a subtle variation, an indication of learning, adaptation, and dialogue without words. Jonas strummed a low, deliberate chord on his guitar. The sound carried softly across the ash, blending with the wind. It was not music for performance, but a rhythm for shared awareness, a gentle pulse linking presence to presence. The distant settlement responded in kind. From a distance, figures adjusted stone arrangements, shifted small piles of ash, and left subtle traces atop a low ridge. Each gesture was careful, deliberate, and reciprocal, acknowledging the tokens and patterns left by Haven's Rest. Calorin recorded every detail in the ledger: distances, alignments, adjustments, and movement patterns. Each observation reinforced the settlers' understanding that interaction need not be hasty or verbal. Connection could emerge through pattern, attention, and deliberate gestures. Children watched from the ridge, learning the art of subtle communication. Their small hands traced spirals in ash, mirroring both the patterns they had seen and those created by the distant settlement. In doing so, they learned that presence, patience, and careful repetition could speak volumes without a single word. As afternoon deepened, the group explored a small hollow between the settlements, a natural path that curved gently across the ash plains. Here, signs of the distant settlement's routines were clearer: small fire pits, careful arrangements of stones, and subtle impressions suggesting tool use or movement. Marla paused to note the orientation of a small ash spiral, realigning a few stones to match the patterns they had been practicing. Every action was careful, deliberate, and respectful of the other community's space. The goal was not to dominate or impress, but to acknowledge, mirror, and gently communicate. Calorin catalogued the spiral in the ledger, noting its dimensions, alignment, and subtle variations. These were gestures of understanding, building shared rhythm and trust. By evening, the settlers returned to Haven's Rest, moving slowly, deliberately, their boots tracing shallow impressions in the soft ash. Fires glowed faintly in the hallways. Children were tended, and the ledger received its day's entries. Patterns of exchange noted. Stone spirals mirrored and adapted. Reciprocal gestures acknowledged. No intrusion, no haste. Eliza addressed the council softly. We are building communication without words, trust without proximity, and presence without intrusion. That is the rhythm that guides us safely. Jonah's guitar hummed low through the hall, a subtle echo of the day's exchanges, while the wind moved faintly across the plains. The distant settlement remained visible as small, deliberate glimmers of fire and shadow. Night settled quietly. Fires burned low in both settlements, casting soft glows through drifting ash. The community of Haven's Rest exhaled in calm understanding. They had witnessed patterns, reciprocal gestures, and silent acknowledgement. the wasteland, patient and expansive, offered lessons in measured connection. Children slept under blankets dusted lightly with gray. Adults closed the day's ledger, and the wind whispered faintly through skeletal trees and low ridges. Observing and recording had become a shared rhythm, a bridge across distance and a lesson in gentle patience. Tomorrow the ash plains would await, quiet and persistent. The settlers of Haven's Rest, guided by observation, reflection, and deliberate gestures, had discovered that meaningful connection could emerge without haste, fear, or alarm. And as the embers of the fire glowed softly beneath a sky brushed with ash and distant stars, the community rested in quiet assurance that the world beyond the ridge could be understood one careful, attentive step at a time. The ash plains were soft beneath the early morning light, touched with pale gold where the sun brushed across the horizon. Haven's Rest awoke slowly, its fires glowing, faintly before the dawn fully claimed the sky. Children stretched under blankets dusted with ash. Adults moved deliberately through the familiar rhythms of tending, repairing, and preparing, and the wind whispered softly through skeletal trees and distant ridges. Eliza gathered the council in the central hall. "Yesterday's exchanges were observed," she said softly. "Patterns mirrored, gestures acknowledged. Today, we will extend our rhythm." There was no urgency, no insistence. The settlers understood that trust, observation, and patient engagement were their most reliable guide. By mid-morning, a small group set out, Calorin, Marla, Jonah, and others with steady hands and attentive eyes. They carried essential tools, tokens of acknowledgement, and small provisions. Every step was deliberate, leaving soft impressions in the ash that would tell a story of presence and care. The ridge was reached with careful pace. From above, the distant settlement glimmered in faint morning light. Fires glowed, smoke rose in thin, deliberate ribbons, and subtle patterns of movement revealed residents engaged in quiet, repeated routines. Marla suggested arranging a spiral of stones at the midpoint of the ridge, a gesture designed for reciprocity. The spiral was not large, not elaborate, but precise. Each stone aligned with care, each gesture deliberate. It was an invitation to mirror and to engage in rhythm. Jonah strummed low chords on his guitar, steady and soft, blending with the faint wind and drifting ash. The music carried across the plains, a shared pulse that neither demanded response nor imposed presence. From the distant settlement, figures responded. Stones were adjusted, spirals subtly mirrored, and soft smoke trails curled into the wind. The actions were reciprocal, deliberate, and careful, a continuation of the silent dialogue that had grown over the past days. Calorin documented every movement in the ledger, alignments, distances, subtle variations, and the timing of gestures. Every observation reinforced the lesson the settlers had learned. Connection could emerge through deliberate attention, patience, and calm observation. Children watched from the ridge, tracing patterns in ash, mimicking the gestures they had seen and understanding that careful action could communicate across distance. Their small hands learned the rhythm of presence, the gentle art of acknowledgement without words. As afternoon deepened, the groups continued their quiet engagement. Small tasks, mirrored and synchronized, formed a shared rhythm, adjusting stones, tending minor ash piles, arranging fire remnants, and noting subtle changes in wind and light. There was no rush, no demand, only a gentle repetition that built understanding and connection. Marla paused to observe a feather placed atop one spiral by the distant settlement, a deliberate acknowledgement of prior gestures. She added a small stone atop it. In return, every motion was thoughtful, deliberate, and calm, reinforcing trust and observation without intrusion. Calerin catalogued these exchanges in the ledger. The day's notes reflected not urgency or alarm, but a measured understanding of presence, attention, and reciprocity. Evening approached. Fires in both settlements glowed softly, reflecting the warmth of patient engagement. Children returned to the hall, their small hands and eyes full of the lessons learned in quiet observation. Adults tended tools, maintained routines, and recorded observations, weaving attention and care into the fabric of daily life. Eliza addressed the council softly. Our rhythms align. Presence has been acknowledged, trust reinforced. Observation, reflection, and gentle gestures have built connection without intrusion. That is enough for now. Jonah played a final, low chord on his guitar, harmonizing with the subtle wind and drifting ash. The music lingered, soft as a whisper, carrying across the ridge and reaching the distant settlement. It was a shared pulse, a rhythm of understanding, patience, and calm engagement. Night fell across the ash plains. Fires glowed faintly in both settlements. The sky brushed with muted stars behind drifting ash clouds. The wind moved in subtle waves, carrying the quiet scent of earth and smoke across distance and ridge. The ledger received its final entry. Shared rhythm observed. Reciprocal gestures acknowledged. Connection maintained without haste. Patterns of presence and attentions continue. The settlers exhaled in calm understanding. Children slept deeply under blankets dusted lightly with gray. Adults rested beside low fires, and the ash plains held their quiet expanse between the two communities. Observation, patience, and deliberate attention had created connection without urgency, without fear, and without intrusion. And as the embers glowed softly beneath a sky muted with ash, Haven's Rest rested in the knowledge that careful presence, patient rhythm, and gentle exchange could bridge worlds, sustain trust, and nurture understanding in the quiet wasteland. The ash plains lay quiet under a pale morning sky, soft gray light stretching across skeletal trees and distant ridges. Haven's Rest stirred slowly, the fires of the central hall flickering faintly before the dawn fully emerged. Children stretched under blankets dusted lightly with ash. Adults moved deliberately through their familiar routines, and the wind whispered softly through empty streets and open fields. Eliza convened the council at the hearth. The patterns of exchange are becoming consistent, she said softly. The distant settlement mirrors our gestures. Today, we will introduce gentle coordination, shared routines without urgency, a rhythm to link presence and practice. The council nodded, understanding the emphasis on patience, observation, and mutual care. No rush was permitted. No pressure was applied. The act itself was a lesson in rhythm, in attentive presence, in deliberate acknowledgement. By mid-morning, a small group departed toward the ridge. Calerin, Marla, Jonah, and two others chosen for steady hands and calm presence. They carried simple tokens, carefully folded cloths, and notebooks for observation. Every step left shallow impressions in the ash, tracing intention and attention across the plains. The distant settlement was visible below, its fires glowing softly, smoke rising in thin, deliberate streams. Figures moved deliberately, tending their own tasks, adjusting stone spirals and arranging small ash patterns. Every action mirrored care, patience, and rhythm, reflecting the habits of Haven's Rest. The group paused on the ridge, observing without approaching too closely. Marla suggested introducing a subtle shared task, arranging parallel spirals of ash, one by each settlement, intended to mirror each other's patterns without direct interaction. The spirals were precise yet gentle, deliberate yet unobtrusive. Jonah played low, measured chords on his guitar. The notes wove through the soft wind, blending with drifting ash, forming a quiet rhythm that both communities could follow. It was not music for performance, but a pulse to guide presence and coordination. Caloran recorded every detail: positions of spirals, distances between markers, adjustments over time, and timing of gestures. Each entry reinforced the settlers' understanding that connection could grow through careful observation and shared, deliberate action. As the day progressed, both settlements engaged in parallel routines. Adjustments were mirrored, spirals evolved subtly, and gestures acknowledged across distance. There was no verbal communication, no confrontation, only deliberate presence and attention. Children practiced tracing smaller patterns in ash near the ridge, learning that care, observation, and patient replication could communicate understanding across space. Adults tended tasks with steady hands, reinforcing the rhythm of shared coordination and gentle acknowledgement. Marla observed a small feather placed atop one spiral by the distant settlement. In response, she added a tiny stone atop a nearby spiral. Every gesture was measured, deliberate, and reciprocal, a quiet dialogue of patience and attention. Caloran documented the details carefully in the ledger. Spiral dimensions, spacing, alignment, and subtle variations. Each note reinforced that deliberate, calm action could build connection without urgency, fear, or alarm. As afternoon waned, the sun cast long shadows across the ash plains. Fires glowed faintly in both settlements. The wind carried whispers of distant smoke and faint scents of scorched earth, and the quiet rhythm of coordinated gestures persisted. Eliza addressed the council softly. Our actions are acknowledged. Patterns are recognized. The rhythm is maintained. Presence has been met with presence. That is enough for now. Jonah played a few final chords, low and steady, harmonizing with the wind and drifting ash. The notes lingered, soft as a whisper, weaving between the two settlements, marking the end of the day's coordinated routines. Night fell gently across the wasteland. Fires glowed faintly in Haven's Rest. Children slept under blankets dusted with ash. Adults closed the ledger and tended remaining tasks, and the distant settlement glimmered quietly across the ridge. Observation, patience, and deliberate attention had grown into a shared rhythm, a connection measured by gestures, mirrored patterns, and attentive presence. The ash plains held their quiet expanse between the two settlements, and both communities rested in calm understanding. Tomorrow, new patterns might emerge, new gestures might be introduced. For now, Haven's Rest exhaled in assurance. Connection could be nurtured through patient, careful engagement. And as the embers glowed softly beneath a sky muted by drifting ash, the settlers rested in the knowledge that gentle coordination could bridge distance, sustain trust, and nurture understanding in the quiet wasteland. The ash plains lay muted beneath the early morning sky, a soft haze diffusing the first pale rays of sunlight. Haven's Rest stirred into the calm rhythm of its routines. Fires glowed faintly in the central hall. Children stretched under blankets dusted lightly with gray ash, and adults moved deliberately through familiar tasks, watering the small garden, tending Brahmin, repairing fences, and recording observations. Eliza gathered the council quietly. Our exchanges with the settlement beyond the ridge have become consistent, she said softly. We now have a rhythm of presence, observation, and acknowledgement. Today, we reflect on what these patterns teach us and how careful engagement shapes our understanding of the wasteland. The council nodded, acknowledging the importance of observation, patience, and reflection as a form of competence and care. Caloran walked the perimeter, tracing shallow impressions left by previous days' footsteps. Each indentation in the soft ash told a story. Small gestures mirrored, spirals adjusted, and subtle signs of attention exchanged across distance. The patterns were deliberate, measured, and intentional, a reflection of mutual understanding cultivated over time. He noted the wind's direction, the shifting light, and the gentle movement of ash over the plains. Even in the vast emptiness, presence could be recognized and acknowledged without haste. Observation itself became a quiet act of connection. Marla gathered children at the ridge. "Notice the spirals," she said softly. "They move and change with care. Every stone, every feather, every adjustment tells us that someone else is watching, learning, and acknowledging our actions." The children traced patterns in ash, observing similarities and subtle variations. They learned that connection could be measured through patience, attention, and gentle mirroring, not through words or urgency. Jonah played low, deliberate chords on his guitar. The notes drifted across the ash plains, carrying with them the rhythm of shared presence and the calm pulse of coordinated gestures. Across the ridge, the distant settlement's fires flickered softly. Subtle adjustments to stone spirals and ash patterns mirrored Haven's Rest's routines. There was no intrusion, no need for words, only careful recognition and measured acknowledgement. Presence met presence, mirrored and deliberate, forming a silent dialogue that stretched across the grey expanse. Caloran documented each detail in the ledger. Alignments, distances, patterns of replication, and subtle variations. Every note reinforced the lesson that connection could be nurtured through deliberate attention, observation, and careful reciprocity. As the day progressed, reflection deepened. Settlers in Haven's Rest noted not only the other settlements' gestures, but their own responses, considering how subtle acts of care, attention, and rhythm shaped mutual understanding. The ash plains, once vast and isolating, became a medium for connection, a canvas for deliberate expression, and a conduit for trust. Eliza spoke softly to the council. "Our presence and theirs are aligned through patience, observation, and gentle engagement. We have learned that connection does not require proximity or words. It requires awareness, attention, and trust cultivated over time." Marla added, "The patterns we leave, the adjustments we make, and the care we practice create a shared rhythm. That rhythm builds understanding and a quiet sense of community across distance." As dusk approached, fires glowed softly in both settlements. The wind carried faint wisps of smoke across the ash plains, blending with the subtle scent of scorched earth and distant flora. Children returned to the hall, their small hands tracing soft patterns in ash, reflecting the day's quiet lessons. Adults recorded observations, intended remaining tasks, closing the day with deliberate calm. Jonah strummed the guitar one final time for the day, low and steady, harmonizing with the wind and drifting ash. The notes lingered, soft as a whisper, bridging ridge and plains, presence and presence. Night fell quietly across the wasteland. Fires glowed faintly in Haven's Rest. Children slept under blankets dusted with ash, and the distant settlement glimmered softly beyond the ridge. The ledger received its final entry, reflections recorded, patterns and gestures observed, mirrored and acknowledged. Shared rhythm continues, trust and understanding nurtured without intrusion or haste. The settlers exhaled in calm awareness. Observation, patience, and deliberate attention had become a quiet form of connection, teaching the community that understanding could emerge gently, measured across space, and sustained over time. And as embers glowed beneath a sky muted by drifting ash, Haven's rest rested in the knowledge that quiet reflection, deliberate gestures, and patient observation could cultivate connection, trust, and understanding in the expansive, patient wasteland. The ash plains lay under a sky brushed with muted gold and soft gray, the morning light diffusing through drifting clouds. Haven's rest stirred slowly, the fires in the central hall glowing faintly, children stretching under blankets dusted with ash, and adults moving deliberately through the calm rhythm of tending, repairing, and observing. The wind carried faint whispers across the plains, soft and deliberate, as if reminding every presence of the shared stillness. Eliza gathered the council quietly by the hearth. "Our exchanges have become a rhythm," she said softly. Presence met with presence, gestures mirrored, patterns acknowledged. Today, we reflect on all that we have learned and allow the ash plains to settle with us. There was no urgency, no expectation beyond attentive observation. The settlers understood that calm, deliberate presence had created a bridge across distance, a connection woven in patience and quiet care. By mid-morning, Caloran, Marla, Jonah, and a small group walked to the ridge. Every step left soft impressions in the ash, each motion deliberate, a continuation of the patterns cultivated over days. The distant settlement glimmered softly below, its fires faintly visible through drifting smoke, shadows moving with careful, intentional rhythm. Marla suggested a simple gesture, arranging small spirals of stones and ash along the ridge, not for instruction, not for observation, but as a quiet acknowledgement of shared presence. The arrangement was deliberate, harmonious, and subtle, a final rhythm linking the two communities. Jonah strummed low chords on his guitar, steady and soft, the notes blending with drifting ash and the faint wind. The sound carried gently, harmonizing with the distant settlement's subtle adjustments to stone and ash. Presence met presence, mirrored and quiet. The day unfolded in gentle observation. Settlers traced spirals, adjusted stones, noted wind direction and light angles, and catalogued subtle variations in gesture and pattern. Children learned to notice nuance. Adults maintained routines, and the ash plains themselves seemed to breathe along with the rhythm of the communities. Caloran recorded meticulously in the ledger. Spirals mirrored, gestures acknowledged, subtle adjustments noted, and shared rhythm maintained. The act of observation, careful and deliberate, had become a form of care itself, a bridge across distance, a lesson in patience and attentiveness. As afternoon deepened, Eliza spoke softly to the council. Our presence and theirs are aligned. Observation has become dialogue, gestures have become trust, and patience has woven connection across the plains. That is enough. The children, now tracing patterns in ash along the ridge, moved slowly, deliberately, learning that even small gestures carried weight when repeated with care. The distant settlement's presence mirrored theirs in subtle, quiet ways. Stones shifted, spirals evolved, smoke curled gently from fire pits, and the rhythm of acknowledgement continued without words or intrusion. Jonah's chords lingered, harmonizing with the wind and the drifting ash. The sound was not music for performance, but a pulse of presence, linking ridge and plains, settlement to settlement. Evening settled across the wasteland. Fires glowed softly in both settlements, casting warm glimmers through the drifting ash. Adults tended remaining tasks, closed the ledger, and prepared spaces for rest. Children returned to blankets, tracing faint patterns in ash with gentle fingers before settling into calm sleep. The final ledger entry of the day read, "Shared rhythm observed and maintained. Patterns mirrored, gestures acknowledged, trust nurtured. Connection sustained without intrusion. Ash plains rest with us. The wind moved softly through skeletal trees, across ridges, and over the plains. Presence had been acknowledged, trust reinforced, and the quiet rhythm of deliberate gestures had created a bridge across distance. Eliza gathered the council for a final moment of reflection. "The ash plains rest," she said softly. "So may we." Observation, patience, and gentle attention have brought understanding and trust. Let our minds and bodies follow this rhythm into rest. Fires burned low. Jonah's final notes lingered. The ash plains stretched quietly between settlements, vast, patient, and gentle. Haven's rest exhaled in calm assurance. Connection had been nurtured, patterns understood, and the wasteland itself seemed to sigh with satisfaction. And as embers glowed softly beneath a muted sky, the settlers of Haven's Rest slept under blankets dusted with grey ash, secure in the knowledge that patience, careful attention, and gentle engagement could create lasting understanding, presence, and calm in the quiet expanses of the wasteland. Dawn arrived slowly over the ash plains, soft light brushing the ridges and settling on the skeletal trees. Haven's Rest awakened quietly. Fires glimmered faintly in the central hall, children stretched under blankets dusted lightly with grey ash, and adults moved deliberately through the measured rhythm of daily routines. The wind whispered softly across the plains, carrying faint scents of scorched earth and distant flora, blending with the subtle sound of low, steady chords from Jonah's guitar. Eliza convened the council in the hall. "The rhythms we have nurtured are enduring," she said calmly. "The distant settlement continues to mirror and acknowledge our gestures. Today, we observe how the patterns have persisted and evolved over time. There was no urgency, no rush. The settlers understood that attention, patience, and quiet repetition were their guides. Observation itself had become a gentle form of connection, an act of care and presence." Caleran walked along the ridge, noting the soft impressions in the ash. Spirals and small stone arrangements remained, subtly altered by wind, careful hands, and the passage of days. Each mark told a story of deliberate attention, of presence acknowledged across distance, and of trust quietly reinforced. Marla gathered children near the ridge. "Look at how the patterns have changed," she said softly. "Each adjustment, each new spiral, reflects the rhythm of another hand, another presence. This is how connection grows, with patience, observation, and care." The children traced gentle spirals in the ash, observing both similarities and subtle differences from previous days. In this quiet repetition, they learned that understanding was built gradually, nurtured with intention and deliberate care. Jonah played low, steady chords, the notes blending with the wind and the drifting ash. The distant settlement responded with mirrored adjustments to spirals and ash patterns. Smoke curled gently from small fires, and subtle gestures continued across the ridge, forming a quiet dialogue of presence and acknowledgement. Caleran documented every detail in the ledger. Spiral placement, subtle shifts, distances between markers, and timing of gestures. Every note reinforced that careful observation, patient repetition, and deliberate engagement could sustain connection without words or intrusion. As the day progressed, the settlers engaged in parallel routines. Small tasks, mirrored and synchronized, formed an enduring rhythm, arranging stones, tracing spirals, adjusting ash patterns, and noting variations in wind and light. The routine was deliberate, careful, and unhurried, a practice in continuity and trust. Marla observed a small feather placed atop a spiral by the distant settlement. She responded by adding a tiny stone atop a nearby spiral. Each gesture was reciprocal, deliberate, and gentle, a quiet acknowledgement of presence and continuity. Evening arrived slowly. Fires glowed softly in both settlements, casting warm light through drifting ash. Children returned to the hall, their small hands tracing familiar patterns in ash, reflecting the day's quiet lessons. Adults recorded observations and tended remaining tasks, closing the day with deliberate calm. Eliza addressed the council softly. Our rhythm continues. Patterns endure, and presence remains acknowledged. Observation and patience have created lasting connection, and trust grows quietly with each gesture. Jonah strummed the guitar one final time, low and steady, harmonizing with wind and drifting ash. The notes lingered, soft as a whisper, linking ridge and plains, settlement to settlement, and presence to presence. Night settled across the ash plains. Fires glowed faintly. Children slept under blankets dusted with grey ash, and the distant settlement glimmered quietly across the ridge. Observation, patience, and deliberate attention had become an enduring form of connection, teaching the community that understanding could be nurtured gently over time. The ledger received its entry. Patterns persist, rhythms endure. Gestures mirrored, presence acknowledged. Trust maintained without intrusion. Ash plains rest with us. As embers glowed softly beneath a muted sky, Haven's rest exhaled in calm assurance. Connection, trust, and understanding had become woven into the quiet rhythm of life, sustained across distance and nurtured patiently, deliberately, and gently in the expansive wasteland. The ash plains stretched quietly beneath a sky brushed with muted gold and gentle gray. Morning arrived softly, light diffusing through drifting clouds and settling upon the skeletal trees and distant ridges. Haven's rest awoke with measured calm. Fires glimmered faintly in the central hall, children stretched under blankets dusted with ash, and adults moved deliberately through familiar routines, tending gardens, maintaining fences, tending the Brahmin, and quietly observing the rhythm of life. Eliza gathered the council by the hearth, her voice soft, measured, and calm. The days have passed with quiet rhythm, she said. Presence met with presence, gestures mirrored, patterns acknowledged. Today, we reflect on the endurance of what we have nurtured, the ash plains, the ridges, and the subtle bridge between settlements. There was no urgency, no expectation beyond attentive observation. The settlers understood that patience, observation, and deliberate care had created a lasting connection, sustained across distance and time. Caloran walked the ridge, noting the soft impressions left in ash. Stone spirals, ash patterns, and small gestures remained in quiet dialogue with the distant settlement. Each mark, each spiral, told a story of patient attention and trust, quietly nurtured. Even as wind moved faintly across the plains, the patterns endured, resilient and deliberate. Marla gathered the children near the ridge. "Look at what has endured," she said softly. "Every spiral, every stone, every subtle gesture tells us that connection grows with patience, attention, and care. These are lessons of presence and understanding." The children traced patterns in ash, observing the subtle evolution of shapes over days and weeks. Each trace spiral became a quiet testament to continuity, trust, and shared rhythm. Jonah played low, gentle chords on his guitar, harmonizing with drifting ash and the faint wind. The distant settlement's subtle movements, the careful adjustment of stones and spirals, the curling smoke from small fires, mirrored Haven's rest in quiet acknowledgement. Presence met presence, deliberate, measured, and reciprocal. Caloran recorded every detail in the ledger, spiral alignments, distances, gestures, and timing of adjustments. Each observation reinforced the understanding that patient attention, deliberate action, and careful presence could cultivate connection without words, proximity, or urgency. As the day unfolded, the settlements engaged in gentle routines. Stones were arranged, ash spirals traced, fires tended, and observations noted. The rhythm was deliberate, steady, and unhurried. Children and adults alike participated, understanding that continuity, attention, and reflection were as vital as any tangible provision in sustaining connection. Marla observed a tiny feather placed atop one spiral by the distant settlement. She responded with a small stone atop a nearby spiral, a gesture gentle, reciprocal, and deliberate. The quiet dialogue had become second nature, a shared rhythm written in stone, ash, and care. Evening arrived slowly. Fires glowed softly in both settlements, casting warm, flickering light through drifting ash. Children returned to blankets, tracing gentle spirals with small hands before settling into calm sleep. Adults tended final tasks, closed the ledger, and allowed the day's rhythm to settle into quiet assurance. Eliza addressed the council for the final time. Our presence endures, the patterns persist, and trust remains nurtured. Observation and patience have built lasting connection. The ash plains rest, and so may we. Jonah strummed a final chord, low and steady, harmonizing with wind and drifting ash. The notes lingered, soft as a whisper, bridging ridges, settlements, and hearts across distance. Presence, trust, and understanding had become woven into the rhythm of life. Night fell across the wasteland. Fires glowed faintly, children slept under blankets dusted with ash, and the distant settlement shimmered quietly beyond the ridge. The ledger received its closing entry, enduring rhythm observed. Patterns mirrored, gestures acknowledged, trust sustained, connection nurtured across distance. Ash plains at rest, haven's rest exhaled in calm assurance. Observation, patience, and deliberate attention had created lasting connection and understanding. The ash plains, vast and quiet, held both settlements in gentle embrace. And as embers glowed softly beneath a muted, drifting sky, the settlers rested fully, knowing that patient observation, careful gestures, and shared rhythm could create lasting trust, understanding, and quiet presence in the enduring expanses of the wasteland.